the form of big steaks. So they're a cut that we wouldn't be that familiar with here, called shoulder chops, but they were the size of big beef steaks, and most of the carcass was being marketed like that. I suppose the big difference that we have with that, and they're able to get away with that, and they have different production methods and everything like that. And the lambs were coming into obviously a big return. Just there was no maximum carcass weight limits or anything like that. Obviously, we're aware here that the European market is a lot different, and in general, the requirements of most of our markets suggest anyway that the best carcass, or the most versatile and the easiest carcass to utilize and to market, is a lamb carcass of really between 18 and 21 kilos. And the reason for that is that the most valuable cuts of the lamb, really are situated in the loin. So that's where the center loin is, where you make your center loin chops. Similarly, the rack as well too, and even the leg. So the leg is obviously a valuable cut also, but really there is an ideal size for each of those cuts, which also influences the price point that those cuts can be sold at, regardless of whether you're selling them into a restaurant or whether you're selling into a retailer, ultimately to be cut and to be sold either over the butcher's counter or on the supermarket shelf. So carcass weight is something that's important, and the kill-out percentage of lambs, as most of you will know better than myself, the kill-out percentage of lambs will vary according to the genetics, according to the level of finish, according to the conformation of the lamb, and the stage of the season as well. So they'll kill out an awful lot better those young lambs, maybe those well-fleshed, well-bred young lambs, maybe coming straight off the ewe at 10, 12 weeks of age. If they've done a good thrive, they'll kill out very, very well, even up to 50% and more. Whereas later on in the season, kind of a lamb that's obviously older, even approaching hogget stage, the kill-out percentage will be a lot less, down to 42 or 43%. Again, depending on how much the lamb has grown, it'll depend on also whether it's a ram lamb or a castrate or a wether. That the ram lamb, obviously, they will tend to stay leaner, a little bit harder to finish then. So in general, they'll just need to be watched in order to make sure that they have the fat cover before going factory. And then obviously the female, the ewe lamb or yo lamb, is the easiest to finish and will put on fat cover faster than either the types of male lambs. Now, the example that I have up here, this is what you'd class as being your kind of ideal lamb. So it's a lamb carcass, 20 kilos, an R grade in conformation. So it's not, an extreme in terms of, having U grade or better conformation. It's just a nice straight carcass and nice fat cover. So the grade that we'd be putting on this, and indeed the factory graders would be looking at it and would look at it across a couple of different angles. You'd see it from the side as well, but looking at it straight on like this, you can tell that it's an R grade in conformation. It's not quite a U grade. And it's a fat score 3. So at fat score 3, it just has enough of fat cover right across the back or across the loin, and similarly around the leg, that you can't see just the straight meat, the red. It's nicely covered by a light cover of fat, and you're not talking about any much more than 3 millimeters or so, or 4 millimeters of fat cover over the meat. So it's just perfect. And the reason that you need that fat cover, it's not just because of the flavor or because of the fact that if you cook it and it doesn't have fat, it tends to dry out, but it's also in order that it will preserve better during transport. That if, for example, and nowadays most of the lamb is cut, so it's no longer exported in a lot of cases in carcass form. In most cases now within the meat plant, about 2/3 of our sheep meat exports are now exported in the form of value-added products. So in the cut products, it might be cut into, for example, from the top down, you'd have the shank, then you'd have the main part of the leg, and next down from that you have the chump, which for example, in a beef carcass, that's the equivalent of the rump. And then down from that, then again, you have the loin cuts. So you have the rack and you have the center loin, and then you're back down then towards the shoulder of the animal. But a little bit of fat cover is perfect. Fat score 3 there is ideal. And when of sheep, it's not quite as complicated as in the case of beef. In the case of beef, the 15 subgrades. So you have, an R minus and an R equals and an R plus. In the case of lamb grades, we're just talking about R's and U's. And in the case of, poorer quality or even some of the hill sheep, they'll fall into an O grade in conformation. But, a bit easier in terms of putting the grades on the carcasses. And then in relation to fat cover, we're talking about fat score 2s being a little bit under finished, not quite enough fat cover really for what we're looking for. A fat score 3 then just being a bit better. And in this case, really a fat score 3 is ideal, similar to this carcass here. If they go into a 4, then it's a 4L or a 4H. A 4L is still ideal. It's not excessive. Just a little bit more fat cover than that carcass that we're looking at there. If it goes into a 4H, just a bit excessive. It just means that when that lamb carcass goes down into the butchery area, in the boning hall or the cutting room of the meat plant, means that there'll be a bit more waste. There'll be more fat to have to be cut off. And in terms of presenting those cuts then to the consumer, they just look a little bit fattier. So it's one of the reasons maybe that some shoppers are a bit averse towards lamb or are a bit reluctant to buy lambs. There's a perception there that it's fatty. However, the vast majority of people who buy lamb, they love the flavour. So there is a trade-off there, but increasingly, there is that awareness there that too much fat rather, and there is an ideal level. So just, I suppose, in summary about that image there, you're talking about a lamb carcass around 20 kilos of an R3. So, perfect for the vast majority of our customers in our markets. And we can come back over these anyway, but the next example then that I have is this one here. So very similar in terms of its conformation to the previous example. You can see them there against one another. So again, this one, I would be suggesting that it's an R grade as well. You can see that it tapers in a little bit there, all right, in terms of it's just in front of the leg, and that's because it doesn't have the same level of finish. It's not as well finished or as well covered as the previous one, but it's quite similar in terms of conformation. So you're still talking about an R grade lamb in terms of its conformation. It's definitely not an O because it still has that good, nicely shaped hindquarter and a reasonably good straight loin as well too. You can see in comparison to the previous one that the back is a little bit more sunk in, but that is mainly because it's not as well finished. So in terms of fat cover, really we're talking about a 2 here as opposed to a fat score 3. So it's a bit under finished, and the consequence of this is going to be that when it is cut up, it's just not going to present quite as nicely as the previous example. The leg is going to be a bit too lean, when it's either vacuum packed or presented there inside in a butcher's counter. It's going to be very lean with very little. And when it's cooked, that product has the potential to just dry out a bit too much. It's not going to be quite as juicy and succulent, even in the cooking of the higher price cuts like the rack, like the loin. You would just be suggesting that it's not quite well finished enough. We'd prefer to see, for example, that lamb left off for another few weeks, and by the time then that it would be brought in, either after a period of grazing good grass or even a small bit of meal supplementation, it would be presented as a nicer carcass. So that example was actually an 18 kilo carcass. So size-wise, it was still fine. 18 kilos, it wasn't too light or anything like that. But if it had been left back for a few weeks, it would have killed out better and it would have graded better. And for the producer, it would have come into more revenue and a better check. So we have seen obviously a very optimistic sheep market right throughout the year. Prices have been good. On average, they've been up by 50 to 60 cents a kilo right throughout the year. So there is every reason there to be optimistic for next year. It's probably the most resilient or the most Brexit-proof sector, because in relation to the UK, we do export a small amount of sheep meat to the UK market, but that is mainly, I suppose, manufacturing meat. Some of it is mutton, and some of it is product going into some of our halal customers in the British market. But the main factor in relation to Britain is that they themselves are a major exporter of lamb. So post-Brexit, and we're only 3 weeks away really now at this stage, but the indications are that even if there is a deal, and obviously, of course, we all hope that we continue to have access to the British market, and there continues to be reasonably free access and reasonable trading conditions. But even in that instance, it's not going to be as easy for Britain to export their sheep meat into the European market as it has been heretofore. There are going to be increased checks. There is going to be some level of customs procedures as well too to have to be gone through. So as a result of that, they're not going to be as aggressive in terms of exporting their UK sheep meat into European markets. And for that reason, there's every reason to be optimistic that we're going to be able to capitalize on the fact that the market is going to be a bit tighter, and the demand is still going to be there across continental Europe, in markets like France, in markets increasingly also slightly further afield, including the likes of Germany and Belgium. Those are premium markets, but they do have these particular buying requirements. And because they're paying a decent price for the product, they expect it and they demand it to be right. So just the consequence of having an underfinished lamb like this, you don't have quite as many selling options for that product. If you're really trying to sell into the highest price customers, whether they be retailers or indeed food service customers or restaurant customers, when that trade fully recovers, you really want to be talking about ideally that product coming from like an R3 or a U3 lamb in that kind of 18 to 21 kilo carcass weight range. So the next example now that I have just to show you is similarly as well. It's a nice lamb. It's a really nicely produced lamb. It's obviously got a good level of finish. The farmer has done a good job on it in terms of its rearing and its genetics. It's a good quality, well-conformed lamb again. It's a good R. It's probably not quite a U in terms of conformation. That hind quarter, that hind leg, it's not extremely well shaped. At the same time, it's just nicely formed. So we would be saying again that it's an R grade in terms of its conformation, and we'll just have a quick flick back between the three carcasses. They're not that different in terms of shape. You would see that this one is probably just a little bit more pushed out in terms of its hind quarter and in terms of the development of that loin or back area as well as the shoulder. But that is mainly the consequence of the fact that it is a very well finished lamb, and in fact you would say that it's excessively well fleshed. So there's a bit too much fat on that ideally, and when you would go to cut that, and indeed even to take the higher priced cuts, again the rack and the center line from that, the fat cover would be just a little bit excessive. So that would mean that in the cutting room, in the boning hall, there would have to be a certain amount of fat trimmed off that, and it just would be gone a little bit too far. I know that can be made up for, but that means a little bit of extra labor cost, and it also means a bit of waste. So the grade that we would be putting on this, and in fact it was a lamb that was a bit heavier, it was just over 22 kilos in carcass weight, and this one was an R4H. So it was nearly a 5, was nearly, being at the top of the scale in terms of fat cover. It's not quite a 5. You can see that around the shoulder area that it still has part of the meat there, or part of the carcass that wasn't fully, covered with this full uniform covering of fat. But at the same time, you can see right across the carcass that it is, almost totally covered anyway in about a fat cover of between 8 millimeters and 12 millimeters. So there's nearly a half an inch thick of fat draped across the carcass. And if we were to go back maybe 20, 30 years ago, you know, before any of you were out and about and buying lamb, that traditionally would have been what many customers would have demanded. You know, that you know, lamb at the time was perceived as being, you know, lovely and flavoursome, and it was cooked for a long time, and that fat would have, you know, dripped into the meat and made it nice and flavoursome and succulent. But nowadays, I suppose increasingly our export markets would prefer a slightly leaner cut of meat. In continental Europe, so around France and even in Germany and in Italy, they don't tend to cook the product for as long either. So they'll cook it for until it's either medium rare. So again, that level of fat that's on that carcass there, if you only cooked it for that amount of time, the fat would still be almost sitting on the outside of the meat. So that's another consequence of having too much fat. And again, those markets that just do not like, you know, to have too much fat on the product. It's similar even when we're marketing beef into those markets, that they have their preference, and just that would be discounted, or at least there would be a good lot of trimming required in order to bring it to their requirement. So, you know, really they're the key things to look out for in relation to the grading. And so the variables that we're talking about are, there's the carcass weight, which there's the very extreme example of the one over in California that I showed you, which, you know, you'd never see anything like that here. You'd never see anything even half as heavy as that, really. It's the absolute extreme end of the scale, because nobody would produce it. It's too heavy and you wouldn't get paid for it anyway. But, you know, carcass weight range, ideally you're talking about 18 to 21 kilos, and depending on the time of the year, there's a cutoff anyway. You could at times get paid up to 21.5 kilos, 22.5 kilos, depending on the meat plant and the specific arrangement that's in place at that time of the year. And there's no point in producing any more than that, because it costs money to put it there, and then if you're not going to get paid for it, which is the case, and that has been in place for a long time now, and it's based on the market requirements. So it's often talked about free when that, geez, I gave away free lamb to the factory because I produced a good few lambs that were 23 kilos. But when you think about it, it might feel like free lamb, but actually it's lamb that hasn't as good of a value because the carcass itself is too heavy, and you're producing cuts then that are just somewhat heavier than what customers are looking for ideally. Then the other two factors that we have to concentrate on after the carcass weight are the conformation and the fat cover. And so conformation, like I was saying, it's not as complex as for the beef, because really you're talking about three grades really, and mainly two. You're talking about R grades, which are a nice, good, straight carcass like that, and a U grade then, which is just slightly better than that. I know you have E grade lambs, but they're, to some extent anyway, they're more unusual. They're not really the norm. You have Beltex and Texel that occasionally, will give you more extreme shaped carcasses. And there are some markets for the cuts coming from those, but in general, a U grade is more than good enough for any of the customers that we're supplying really with lamb from Ireland. So that's the case anyway. I don't have the different examples, but you would have O grades, R grades, and U grades. And then in relation to the fat cover, then again, it's not as complex as for beef, where you have all the different subgrades, or you have for example a 2+ or 3 different 3s. You have a 3- or a 3 equals, or a 3+. In the case of lamb, just really need to be focused on, is it a fat score 3, or is it a bit less fat than that? For example, in the case of that lamb there, he's only a 2, or is it a bit more than a 3? So in this case, it's a 4, and it's actually even a 4H because it has a bit too much fat in it. So hopefully that gives a bit of a flavour anyway, a bit of a picture in relation to what we're looking for And there is obviously, we're just looking at carcasses here, there is obviously the grading of the lambs, which is the harder job. It's the decisions that you yourselves are making at farm level when you're drafting your sheep. You're weighing them, or at least you're getting your eye in terms of getting a benchmark as to how heavy the lambs are. Are they ready? Are they not quite ready? You're looking at the different areas then on the lambs themselves in terms of selecting them. You don't want to go too hard on them, in which case you could cause bruising on the carcass. And there is an example of a little bit of bruising there on that fat carcass, just there around the tail or around the hindquarter of the lamb. There's a small bit of bruising, and that's probably just it got a bit of a knock from something prior to slaughter. So they do bruise quite easily. So you want to go easy on the sheep as you're drafting them, as you're selecting them for the factory. You don't want to go too hard on them. But again, the areas that you will, I suppose, be focusing on in terms of the sheep themselves, because even as lambs, right, they have tight enough wool to see when you get used to it how much fat cover is on them. But you have to handle them. You have to get used to them as well too. And that decision will be, right, you'll be handling them. You'll be kind of maybe handling around their rib area, which you'll be able to get a feel there for how tight the wool is, or in other words, what level of fat is sitting there in behind and their skin against, I suppose, their intercostal muscles or around their rib. You'll be doing similar to that as well too on their loin, so between their shoulder and I suppose kind of halfway back along their back, in order to see is there a little bit of fat cover there, or what the story is there. And similarly then lastly, you'll be touching, you'll be just seeing, I suppose, in behind them as well too, in behind at the back of their tail, you'll be just seeing what kind of fat cover is there as well too. Again, handling them lightly, just to see, I suppose, what level of fat is sitting there in under the skin, reflecting as well then the amount of fat that there is on the carcass. As we say, the I suppose carcass fat or fat cover on the actual carcass itself, and it's a case of getting used to it really, and practicing and literally getting a feel for it really like that. So I hope that gives a bit of a flavour anyway, or a bit of an indication as to what we're looking for in relation to the scoring and the grading of the lambs. I don't know, Thomas or Amanda, whether you want to have any questions or any maybe pointers or anything like that, or have anything else to add.
Yeah, if people want to take the opportunity maybe to ask a few questions. I know we have a few beef and sheep farmers on, or if people want to add that into the chat and we can ask the questions one or the other.
Will the carcasses been shown like that with the way they were for regional rounds? Do you know the way they were cut? It was a cut section.
I need to double check that, Maeve. I think the carcass images that we have for the finals don't have the cut images on them.
Okay, that's okay.
So yeah, and again, they won't be the exact same as that. So there'll be different sheep, there'll be different carcasses, but we will, I think, have side images as well. So I only had the image of the full carcass hanging from the back, and I think when we're looking at the final graded images, we'll have a side image and we'll have the same equivalent as that, so the carcass from the back.
You don't have any image of a U or O grade carcass, do you?
Let me, what I'll do, I might even pull it out and stick it up on the group if that's okay, and put it into the notes. Let me just see now. I'll have a quick look here through what's here. I know it would be interesting for you to have anyway for our reference.
I know when we were looking through the different examples, it's actually very hard to get an O grade lamb, thankfully. Probably generally just yo lambs and cull yos and stuff like that might be.
True, yeah. Some of the hill lambs mainly that would fall into an O grade, yeah.
I suppose, Joe, it'd be good to see maybe a difference or what we're looking for between an O and an R. What makes, like we've seen a few R's there tonight, but what makes the or go to a U? Like maybe hints as to where to look on shoulder, or do you look at the back legs, or for more kind of and that's I suppose just to be able to differentiate between, is that an R4 or is it a U? And I suppose that's where the difficulty I feel in carcass grading arrives, is just getting that differentiation between, you know, a very good or and then a U, or a very good O and then an or as well. The fat level is very, very good there. It's very well explained. I think though, but I'd say the same in the beef. It's very hard just to make that final call on.
Absolutely, you know. Absolutely. Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. All right, that look, it can be fine enough, the difference, and you could have a photo there, and it just might be a photo that it might look. It just might maybe even look like it's a very good R, and your borderline, geez, it's nearly a U, but it's not quite a U. So it can be a bit difficult then to just. The line is very, you know, fine between the two. We'll try and have, in our examples anyway, we'll try and make sure that the examples that we'll use for the final will be, you know, quite clear. So we won't have one that's very, very borderline. We'll try and have either, if it's an R, it's just, you know, a good old straight R. It's not, you know, very borderline, nearly a U. Of the carcasses that we saw there, probably the one that would be closest to being a U grade was that fattest, that lamb. That is the most fat, because, you know, all of the gaps, all of the kind of maybe kind of tapering points along the carcass are well filled up, just as a result of the fact that it's so well finished. But in order to become a U grade, I would say from looking at lamb carcasses that it just would need a bit more muscle in the hind leg. It just would need to be a bit better developed in terms of its hindquarter, its development of the hind leg, and similarly on the shoulder of the lamb as well too. You'd see it coming out a bit more, and I know that in the case of lamb carcasses, it depends on how they're cut or how they're presented, but you'd definitely be seeing from the neck of the lamb back down to over the shoulder of the lamb just a bit more thickness or a bit more muscle development.
Do we have any other questions? Yeah, Bushy.
Joe, you talked there about the markets and that there. You just briefly mentioned it. Do you see now with the Brexit and the way things are going, that it'll open up the European markets for Irish lamb, or do you think that the English lamb will still pose that I suppose mark there, where they'll still fill up that market?
Yeah, it's a good question, all right, Oisín, because you know, even though we're right down to the wire now, it's very hard to say exactly, you know, what's going to happen yet. This year, there was a lot less UK lamb around the European market. So actually, the UK exported about 20% less of their own lamb into continental Europe. And that was even before we had any real impact of Brexit. So, you know, you'd have to think that when we put further restrictions on the UK in terms of their ability to export, and that's even in the event of the softest and the easiest possible outcome for the UK, they still have to fill out a good bit more paperwork in terms of checks, in terms of customs declarations and things like that. And that will cause a bit more delay. There will also be some additional costs, even though they're what you call non-tariff measures. So, you know, that's even in the event, as I say, of the softest Brexit, they still are going to have those additional difficulties or, you know, just some additional requirements anyway to contend with. So that will mean that they're not going to be as aggressive anyway. It is likely that there will still be quite a lot of British lamb around the UK, or rather around continental Europe, into these markets that we're targeting, but they're not going to be as prevalent. And the other factor then, and part of the reason why there was less UK lamb around Europe this year was also the fact that there was far less New Zealand lamb around. So New Zealand over the last few years has increasingly been targeting Asia and China in particular. So they haven't really been as aggressive then in Europe. They haven't even come near filling their quota in the European market. And so, you know, traditionally one of their biggest markets would have been the UK, and they would have sent a lot of New Zealand legs to the UK, and that hasn't happened. That didn't happen this year. That was part of the reason that within Britain, within their own market, because they didn't have the imports coming in of New Zealand legs, actually that meant that their own market was better for them. They were able to sell their own British lamb easier at home, and that reduced down the volume that they had available then to export. So, you know, really this year has been, that's the reason that it has been so, I suppose, positive and favourable, in spite of the fact that, right, it's an expensive meat. We have been hit by COVID. There are economic issues as well too, whereby a lot of people either have lost their jobs or have seen their incomes fall. But in spite of that, and even likewise, the food service, the restaurants have been closed for much of the year. But in spite of that, the demand for lamb has been really, really strong and robust. And you'd have to be positive then for next year, taking all of those factors into account, that, you know, it's likely that there'll even be less UK lamb around. New Zealand, there's no big change likely there, that they're not going to turn on the tap and flood the European market, given their focus increasingly on Asia. So yeah, we definitely would be optimistic anyway in terms of the lamb outlook.
And do you see an increase in the lamb price, or are we probably at what max the market is willing to pay?
Yeah, again, we hadn't probably anticipated that prices would even rise as much as they did this year. I know that for producers there in the springtime producing that, you know, that early spring lamb, you need to be getting every cent out of it because it's a high cost production system. You're obviously breeding early, you're lambing early before grass is really kicking off, and you need to, you know, feed a certain amount of meal as well. So, you know, it never hit the highs of the €7 maybe that we might have seen a few years ago. But the price was very high then throughout the mid-season and even going on throughout the back end. So we would hope that, you'd have a bit more encouraging price for that early lamb, for that very early spring lamb throughout. Kind of Easter is very early next year. Similarly, the Muslim festivals there, Ramadan is very early next year. So you'd anticipate that early spring lamb price will be even a bit higher, all things considered. Similarly, hogget prices as well too are likely to be strong there throughout the spring, you know, given the fact that demand will be there early on in the year. So, you know, all indications would be positive anyway, even for next season.
And do you think this Brexit thing, Joe, will reduce the number of, British lamb being slaughtered here in Ireland?
Yeah, so I suppose coming down from the north this year, the numbers were almost exactly on par with last year. They were down very slightly. The kind of main differences, so at the moment, assuming that there is a deal, assuming that there is an agreement, that it wouldn't absolutely, I suppose, stop or prevent those lambs coming down again. They would have to meet all of those technical requirements. There are going to be at least the same level of checks. In fact, there'll even be a bit more documentation and checks required. One of the difficulties, I suppose, about all things now coming from either Northern Ireland or any other part of the UK and being further processed in the Republic of Ireland, and this is something I'm sure that Thomas Duffy will be all too aware of on the dairy side, is that if you have a product now coming from outside the EU, for example from the UK, and coming into the EU, then coming into Ireland for processing or for slaughter or whatever the case may be, that we can't then export that product to a non-EU market. So if we wanted to export, for example, lamb to Hong Kong, we wouldn't be able to export it from those lambs coming down from the north. Or similarly, you know, some of those other non-EU markets, the likes of Switzerland, the likes of Canada, you know, they wouldn't be covered within our health certificate or within our, you know, technical veterinary protocol that we're exporting those products the EU under. They wouldn't be the product that had spent part of its life anyway in the UK wouldn't be covered under that. So that's probably one of the influences or one of the impacts, that they're not going to be as valuable, they're not going to be as attractive as the home produced Irish lambs. I don't know, Thomas, whether you want to comment on, for example, even on the milk side. If you had milk now coming down from Northern Ireland, obviously, to one of the Irish processors, and they in turn wanted to export infant formula ingredients to China, they couldn't use that Northern milk for that production anymore.
Yeah, there seems to be a particular, I suppose, in terms of the lamb trade and also the dairy trade to mainland EU, like there seems to be, let's assume that there's some sort of deal and some sort of arrangement. It's very likely that, you know, you'll be able to market things as either product of Ireland and Northern Ireland in blended products or in processed products or in some shipping. And they would be covering the UK, Ireland, whatever. But the problem is, if you send them further afield, you're just not going to get them, which means Irish lamb now immediately has a higher value, essentially, because it'll be covered by that. Now, I don't know, the market to third countries and lamb is probably not as large as it is in dairy. It's
quite small. It's quite small. Yeah, maybe the offal would be one factor, all right, whereby the majority of the offal would go to non-EU markets.
Yeah, and in the past, sheepskins would have been a very valuable trade to China. I know there's been a long running discussion about the cleanliness of sheepskins, because they are valuable, or they were at least at one point a little bit less valuable than they were now. Similarly, what we've seen with the decline in the price of wool. Obviously, wool at the moment, the majority of wool was being exported to China. That was primarily for making carpets, I think, as well. That seemed to be one of the major uses of it. And unfortunately, that market has dipped substantively with the rise of synthetic products. But yeah, those would be two kind of places where Irish wool would still be able to be exported. Best of my knowledge, Joe, I don't think any, because most of the even non-food products, product of animal, are covered by the health certs that we would have. So I don't think the UK will even be able to export their wool. Don't.
Yeah. No,
let's take a look at that again.
It's a funny one. I know you would have some European markets as well, like of Italy, that would take a certain amount of them as well. But as you said, in the last few years anyway, China has been the main destination, so they're going to be more limited. Yeah.
So I have a question here, Amanda. Sarah was just asking about the actual format of the competition. So maybe you could take us through that, or what we might do is we might move on to the presentation if there's no more questions for Joe. And Joe, if you want to hang around, you're free to. If you want to tip on, up to you. Unless there's any more questions for Joe.
Yeah, if you want to maybe just maybe Joe will look for that O-grade animal.
Yeah.
Let me do that, Amanda, and I might even just stick them into the group if that's okay. I might put them into the chat on the group just to show them there as an example of an O-grade carcass and maybe of a similar fat cover R-grade and U-grade carcass, just to have.
Yeah, that'd be 100%. And the calculations will only take 5-10 minutes anyway. So
okay, 2 seconds. Cheers.
Yeah, thanks very much, Joe, for that.
Yeah, everyone should be. Is everyone seeing that okay?
Yeah.
Just going to stick it onto presentation mode. Okay, now that's a lot clearer. Okay, so I'm going to be running through the calculations with you. These are, I have double checked all of these as being reasonably representative of the sheep trade, but bear in mind I haven't had any ewes on my farm since I was 7. So when we were doing them up, we were trying to give representational examples. If anyone wants to query prices of that, we're getting a bit of feedback there, just make sure that everyone else is on mute there. Okay, so we will start with the first example. So we have 2 different types of examples here. We have the profitability in the market examples. So I'm going to be running through. So I'm going to run through these. I'm going to run through the kind of the details, the stuff that you're going to be asked, the questions on the 2. Yeah, before we get to the answer. So you have the example there. You purchase a 14-week ram lamb, live weight 35 kilos at €80. Again, if these are not 100% going in the market at the moment, forgive me. The first question you're going to have to answer is, how much have you paid per kg? Very straightforward, it's per kilo price. Should be able to do that. Most men should be doing that in the mart, and most women should be, of course, doing that in the mart when they're going along. And then you have the question of, the animal is factoried, that should be not factoried at 16 days later with a carcass weight of 18.5 kgs. What is the value of the carcass at a factory price of $5.25 a kilo? So those are the two questions you're going to have to answer. If you want to take a second, I'll give you a minute or two to do the quick calculations on. First one should be fairly straightforward, and then I'll leave you to work on the other one while we're working on it as well. I haven't downloaded a video of the little countdown buzzer. So I'll just do the do. So obviously 229. Now if you did the factor, it'd be 228.6, but obviously you can't pay 0.6 of a cent. So we would generally round those in terms of euros. So if you said either 229 cent or 229 euros per kilo, either of those will be accepted in the competition. Don't round up to 3 spaces or whatever it might be, or to 0.2 spaces. So if the lamb is factoried, does anyone want to shout out any answers for this question? Be brave.
€97.13.
Okay. Any increase? Going once. Someone coming in there?
No.
Okay. 97.13. Yeah.
One question. That lamb killed out very well because his percentage was like 52.9% kilos.
There were slight reasons I had to jig out the last killouts and stuff like that. So yeah, the killouts were I will be far more accurate in the county competitions, but it's more to give you a demonstration of it. So yeah, assume a very high killout for that one, and we'll move on. So again, you purchased the 14-week ram lamb, live weight 35 kgs. So we've run through that element of this. Now, so this is, I suppose, where we move from the simple market value to more of the actual complexity. So if the cost of finishing is 40 cents a day, what will the profit on the lamb be? What will the profit on the lamb be? Anyone want to be as brave as Timmy and give their...
$10.73.
10.73. Okay, let's see. Timmy, have you got that?
Yeah.
10.73. Anyone else have anything different? No. So the cost first, 40 cent by 16 days, 640 euros cost, 10.73 is the profit. Again, it's nice, it's straightforward. So these are the carcass returns. So the previous one or the other ones, these are the... So again, this is more calculating, I suppose, a little bit more complicated. So assuming a drop off in performance post-weaning with lambs achieving an average of 170 grams per day, how long will it take the animal to reach a live weight of 45 kilos? 0.17 a day kilograms. How long will it take to reach 45? Anyone want to share an answer? We'll leave Timmy and Oisin. How many?
59.
59 days. 58.87, but we'll say, sure, look, that's the evening of one of the days, so it'll be 59. That'll be the acceptable answer, yeah. Now, move on to the next one. Assuming the lamb is slaughtered at an above rate will kill out of 43%, so a lot more accurate, Timmy, at 540 per kg. What is the carcass value? So this is an animal that is slaughtered at 45 kilos at a kill out of 43. 240. Anyone else want to be as brave? Because I know Timmy's just waiting to jump in.
24.75.
Timmy?
I've got 104.49.
Ah, Jesus.
Off by a wee bit. Anyone else get any other answer?
No, I got the same.
Okay, 100. Yeah, okay. So again, the animal. Yes. Yeah. So I don't know where Ocean's maths went there, but anyway, so that's why you have a workshop. So again, it's 45 kilo live weight animal, killing out 43%, multiplied by 0.43 is 19.35 kgs, which is 104.49 rounded up. Is that what you had, Timmy?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. That's it. Amanda's sheet picture. Oh, I can stop sharing there. Do we have any questions about that?
Just, Thomas, from the pictures for the county round for the sheep Stockjudging, it was good to have them in that, but I know if there was a possibility of more than one or two pictures for some of the animals, or even group pictures of the animals together to help people maybe see a difference. I don't know who is offering them to you. The more you can have, the easier it'll be, because
is this now for the live animals or the carcasses?
Live animals, sorry, live animals. The carcasses are fairly, to be fair, you have two animals for the live animals. Probably make a shite of itself now would be the best at it, but you know, just that even for, I thought for the O's it was difficult to know if there was only one image or something.
So it's no bother. It's 100%. Amanda, I'll take that away and
thanks very much. I know we have this better than that. So.
Yeah, we're working on that anyway, Paddy. We expect to have 4, just like the beef round, 4 of each animal, and then a group, maybe 30-second video of the 4 yos together, just to give you as an indication of size of between the 4 yos. And the same thing with the rams. I suppose just when we were doing the county round, it was in the middle of breeding season, and it was very hard to get them together, especially the rams. But it found it was very hard, you know, farmers didn't want to disturb their sheep pretty much. It's an important time of the year to get that money back in the springtime, as Joe was talking about. So that is the plan anyway. So we're going to leave the... Sorry, Paddy?
No, that's grand. Thanks very much. That sounds great.
Yeah, that's all right. We're going to leave the live feed now. So just before we go, I want to thank Thomas Duffy and Joe Burke, Board B, of course, being our sponsor for the beef and sheep stock judging competition. And we'll continue having a little chat here as well, just about the format of the competition. But for now, we leave the online anyway. So thanks.
No bother, Amanda. I have a couple of examples of just a kind of a very quick comparison, just to have a very short run through on the confirmation in particular. So I might just share my my screen again just very quickly, if that's okay. Just to very quickly show you their confirmation site. There are a group of images of different lamb carcasses, so alongside one another. Now these aren't as high definition or as good of a set of images as you'll be seeing when you're looking at the individual carcasses yourselves, but you can see there just I suppose, the shape difference. Really, you're talking about the level of development in terms of muscularity of the carcass. So an E grade, and we're unlikely to see E grades now in the final, because they don't really happen too often. I know that individual farmers will aspire to try and breed very good and very muscular sheep, but as an overall percentage of the kill, it would be low. More likely to see, and you can see there, a U grade carcass. It just has that bit more shape around, particularly the hindquarter and even around the shoulder. You can see there just the development, and in particular the width of that U grade in comparison to the R grade. R grade, then nothing at all wrong with it. Like I was saying, it's going to be suitable for the vast majority of markets. It's more straight rather than seeing those well-developed hindquarters and shoulders. And when you go down into O grade, then, so rather than even having a straight leg and a straight shoulder and loin, it's going in a bit. So rather than being convex, it's becoming concave. So it's going in around the development of the leg, the hindquarter, and even down into the shoulder, just not as much muscle development at all. And we won't be looking at peas, because a pea, you'd be talking about a very poor quality collio, really. So what we'll be looking at will be will as reflects the industry and the sheep that are produced, somewhere between an O and a U anyway, covers really all of the sheep that we're going to be looking at. And then in terms of fat cover, then, like we were saying, you really have a few different combinations, and this is more simplified, but a one, we're not going to be looking at ones, because they don't really exist to any great extent. You'd be looking at an animal that really is unhealthy if it is only a one. It has basically no fat whatsoever on the carcass coming in to be slaughtered. A fat score 2, then it just has a bit of fat cover. It in some cases it's nearly there. Really, if it was only a store lamb that was brought into the factory and slaughtered, and it didn't have quite enough fat cover really to be killed, that's what you're talking about. It's only going to be a 2. Whereas a fat score 3 then is ideal. It has a light covering of fat right across the main points that you're looking for, in terms of across its hindquarter or its legs, and across the loin as well. And you can see that the shoulder and the neck area are really the last part of the carcass to get covered in fat. It's only when it really gets well finished and it starts to really finish off that the shoulder and the neck area tend to be the last part of the carcass anyway to start seeing that fat cover. And then in terms of 4, you have a 4L and a 4H. A 4L is closer to a 3. It doesn't have quite as much fat cover. It's just a well-covered lamb. A 4H then is closer to a 5. So you start to see even these kind of flecks of fat right up along the back of the leg, if you like, where the fat is nearly curling over itself, and you're seeing that kind of what they call a striation, or basically just streaks of fat across the back. And once you see that, you know that you're nearly heading for a 5, or certainly a 4H anyway, in terms of the lamb. So that's just to kind of recap on the differences between maybe the subtle changes as you go from either an R up to a U, or from a 3 up to potentially a 4H. You don't see that many 5s, thankfully, to be honest.
Thanks very much, Joe, for that. Is there any questions on that? We're going to leave it a little bit easier for you as well, and we don't take into account L and H for the county or for the finals. So it'll be a fat score of 3 or 4 or 5, or 2, of course. So it'll be a little bit easier. Okay, well, thanks very much, Joe. Again, we stay online at the minute now, and thank you very much again, and as well to Mairead, obviously they're hiding behind the Macro logo, for facilitating and setting up everything for us.